Welcome to Hiraeth, a home for the left in Wales. Tonight we're talking about the Welsh tourism industry. Joining us, we have Jim Jones, who is the CEO of North Wales Tourism. Hello, Jim.
Evening to you. Nice to be here.
We also have Edward Evans, who's the chair of Keep Wales Tidy. Hello, Ed.
Hi.
Just so everyone knows, obviously I imagine there's been quite an impact to the tourism industry as a result of the pandemic, but what sort of state was the Welsh tourism industry before lockdown, Jim?
From our perspective, in North Wales, we were what we called, and many times we did call it, we had a booming tourism economy. We had a lot of confidence in our industry. We were quite confident going forward in promoting ourselves as the adventure capital of Europe, for obvious reasons with all the investment that's gone on for the 5 or 6 years. And we were looking forward to a very, very prosperous 2020.
Yeah, look, a little bit different to Jim, really. I'm more of an observer in this respect from a tourism point of view. What I've noticed is there's a number of sectors who actually, before COVID, were struggling anyway. Take the town centres and so on, the retail sector, they were struggling. And COVID has just made things that little bit worse. I'm slightly different to Jim. I'm thinking that the certain parts of the tourism sector were not necessarily doing so fantastically well, and perhaps we'll pick through that as we go through the podcast. But I know there are certainly some high-level places, particularly up in North Wales, Zipwire and so on, which are clearly doing well. So it's a tale of two cities potentially on this.
What do you think COVID has really done in the Welsh tourism industry? It featured a lot in the summer on the news.
Put it bluntly, it's been absolutely catastrophic for the industry. And again, I can only speak of North Wales because that's my patch and I know it really well. And I know, it's worth 3.2 billion to our economy. And if you think at the beginning of 2020, obviously we had the winter, many businesses closed down for the winter and so on. Then we had the real bad spell of weather. So we call that, the second winter. And then as people and businesses start to invest into their business, for example, a hotel who wants to invest in new curtains, new carpets, some of them take extended overdrafts, expecting a booming Easter and a very busy Easter. And that didn't happen. And I think that's what knocked everyone for six. And so the word is definitely catastrophic. It's going to take a long, long time to recover properly. Ed is absolutely right, by the way. There's a lot of businesses that were struggling already. I think there's an example in Llandudno. We had 7, hotels that closed down, big hotels. And that wasn't any fault of COVID. So, so the industry, as far as we're concerned, it was doing extremely well, a lot of investment coming in and so on. But there are other parts of the industry that were, struggling.
What about you, Ed? I know you're looking at other sectors as well, but I also know that your work with Brecon Beacons National Park, how do you think, areas like the national parks have managed with COVID? We saw those days where Wales was in lockdown and we were getting visitors from everywhere.
Yeah, it was an interesting one, actually. I must admit, you mentioned that I'm the chair of Keep Wales Tidy. Used to be chair of the Brecon Beacons National Park Authority as well till a few months ago. And so it had some sort of flavour of what was happening there, some of the challenges for some of the businesses. It was interesting, actually, in the honeypot sites, which have really taken a bit of a hit. I guess it's a little bit similar up in North Wales with Hiraeth and Snowdonia and some of the the people just jamming into those areas. I think more generally, I suppose, through the COVID period. Bottom line is, if you were in self-catering or anything like that, you just didn't have any business, did you? You were struggling. You might have got by on some government grants for a while, but that's not going to take you very far. So yeah, I'd agree with Jim. Really, really difficult for that period, particularly as it was such great weather as well. But coming through that, I suspect Jim might add something to this, but there must have been a bit of a bounce back, I think, over the last month or so, which probably makes this current lockdown period now, as we're heading into it, all the more difficult to take on board, really.
Yeah, Ed, you're absolutely right, because we've had a lot of feedback, and our business, North Wales Tourism, been going 30 years. We have constantly been in touch with our businesses. So basically what I say comes from what the businesses are telling us, because we kind of lobby and represent on their behalf. But August has been very, very busy for everybody. Our hoteliers, our restaurants, the self-catering, glamping has gone absolutely crazy. And obviously we've had fairly decent weather as well. And September is looking good. And also advanced bookings in October are looking good because, staycation is here for quite some time. People are desperate to get out, from their homes. And in our case, our domestic market is the Northwest and some of the Midlands. So they're desperate to get into the open space. So, it's looking okay. We're not out of the woods yet because there's big issues along the line, furlough stopping and other things. So that's going to be a real test for the industry. But at this moment in time, even though we were slow coming out of lockdown, August has been a really good month from the feedback that we've had from our businesses.
Perhaps I can add to that, actually, because we booked a place as a family in West Wales quite early on in this. We cancelled all the foreign stuff because we just weren't going to take the risk, I guess. And I'm glad we stuck with it. We went down to Aberporth in West Wales, absolutely beautiful. And I think if anybody's tried to get a late booking there, forget it for August. It was chock-a-block.
Well, one of the interesting points for this pod for us, gents, was there was a lot of conflict between visitors to Wales and the tourist industry. How do you think that played out over the summer on social media? Anyway, it got a little bit unpleasant at times, I would say.
The thing is, it's always been there. It's always been an underlying issue. And especially, there's been some quite politically sensitive issues, second homeowners and so on, that have generated a lot of speak on social media, a lot of anti-visitors coming into the area, especially the more west you go in North Wales. So it's been difficult because, when we talk about communities and we talk about, people don't want visitors flocking into their communities and so on, the businesses in tourism and hospitality are part of those communities. And we had a deluge of emails constantly, phone calls, because right the way through this, we've been operational and we've been trying to help as much as we possibly can, lobby where we can with our MPs and our assembly members and so on. And that's basically what we've been doing on their behalf. And to listen to some of the stories where people have invested their livelihoods, their pensions into those businesses, and at a click of a button, they've gone. They've lost thousands and thousands. One person, £20,000 booking just gone, and no outlook for a foreseeable time on how they're going to generate some income to survive. And literally, people have been in tears because they see and they fear their business is going to go down. And that's always been the challenge, because even though we've asked them, can we use your story? Can we share it with the media? They're very, very reluctant to do that. And that's also an issue. But I just think, businesses are fundamental part of the community. They were desperate for visitors to come on. I didn't hear many businesses saying they didn't want visitors to come flocking into different parts of North Wales.
Again, as an observer, I guess, not as close to it as Jim, but for me, there were a lot of emotions around this. There was a political aspects to some of it as well. There were all sorts of different things. For me, it's about respect more than anything. It's respect for those people coming into some of those areas. And let's face it, some of those areas can be quite sparsely populated, quite fragile when you've got a pandemic underway. And you're hearing some quite tough stories of things that are happening in maybe some of the more populous areas of not just England but Wales as well. And so there's always going to be some tensions there. There's going to be nervousness. Some people will use it in different ways. I fully understand the needs of those businesses to want people coming in. But I visited a few places through some of them in West Wales, some of them in North Wales. Pwllheli as a prime example. Ooh, it was a bit scary in places. It really was, and I'm not convinced that everybody visiting did show the respect that they should have done. Respect and sometimes the lack of it, I don't think helped on both sides.
Yeah, I think you're right, because I think COVID has made us extra sensitive of physical space, and we currently need more of that. So, having lots of visitors come into small communities, no wonder people, feel quite tense about it, because there's not enough space for them in the shops, there's not enough space for them in the towns. And then on the other side of the coin, these people, some of them, in our domestic market, which in the past that we rely on, to keep our economy going, have been probably holed up in an apartment block for 2, 3, 4 months, and they're just craving for their, the mental well-being, the mental wealth to get out there and enjoy the open, countryside that we have in abundance. So it's a real tough one, and I totally sympathise with those communities that have had that peace and that tranquility for quite some time, and then all of a sudden they've been invaded with visitors. It's a real tough call. But when does it end? How long is COVID going to be here for? Do we say, right, no visitors coming in until COVID's finished? That could be 2 years' time, and the decimation that would do to those communities. And not just the people who work in tourism hospitality. You think about the farmers, the butchers, the grocers, the builders, the window cleaners, the taxi drivers. All that infrastructure supports tourism, and none of them have probably been earning a living whilst tourism hasn't been flourishing within those communities.
The numbers in West Wales and in sort of areas that we're talking about here with regards to COVID have been quite low. Obviously, we're now seeing an uptick in the rates all across Wales, not just in these areas. But do you think there's a danger that this influx is sort of undermining the good work that these rural communities were doing in terms of keeping those numbers down?
Well, I don't think it's just the rural communities that are working to keep the numbers down. I think mass majority of people are working to keep those numbers down. And they are fortunate, because of the rural location that they live, that they are relatively few COVID cases. And I can understand, how fearful they are. That goes without saying. So you totally understand that. But as I said then, but when do you stop? When do you allow the visitors to come back into somewhere like Hiraeth? Because all those people I just mentioned rely on visitors, to give them that livelihood. And it's a real tough call. And I think we've seen some examples in North Wales and Snowdonia. You look at the likes of Abersoch, but the community made the place nicer to welcome, the visitors back. And that was really good to see, because, I read social media and I see all the anti-visitor and so on, which obviously makes me sad, because, we're trying to encourage as many people to come in and enjoy North Wales. So it's difficult when you're up against, that type of rhetoric. But then, it's also tough for them as well, because they've had that peace and tranquility, which they probably crave. But as I said before, the businesses aren't telling us that. So the businesses from North West Wales aren't telling us that they don't want the visitors coming in, and they're very much part of that community as well. But sorry, just one more thing. As Ed said, it's about respect. Our marketing campaign is all about visit, North Wales safely, respect North Wales, and enjoy North Wales. And I think, the small minority that all of a sudden get polarised on social media as, creating all this hate from the community because they leave in rubbish or they're not respecting social distancing and so on. I think the vast majority of people are looking after themselves and respecting other people's space, because, as I said, it's something we crave for at the moment, is that physical space and physical distancing.
I do think that for me, one of the things that's been highlighted through this COVID period, though, is given the amount of staycations, they clearly increased, is the pressure it's put on our infrastructure. Whether that be the roads, the parking, some of the physical buildings that we're in. It was always an issue there. It's always been a problem around where do you park, around the hotspots and so on. But it's kind of brought it to a sharper focus now, because you've got even more people trying to cram into smaller spaces. And the infrastructure is really creaking, really struggling to cope with it all, And I'd be interested to know what some of Jim's thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts on that, because prior to me taking over North Wales Tourism, I used to be the head of tourism communities in Conwy Council. So I've had quite a number of years of experience working in the public sector. And I was absolutely passionate about managing the basic fundamentals of the infrastructure for tourism destinations. Everyone could see this coming. Everyone could see, once lockdown was lifted, they could see the stream of people wanting to visit, not just people from outside of Wales, but also local people as well, wanting to visit our national parks. We knew this was going to happen, yet we weren't prepared for it again. And it's just constant, same things are happening time and time again, and have been happening for years. We can't cope. We haven't got the infrastructure in order to cope with that demand, and we're not doing anything about it. So for me, I think we should have, planned it better. And I say we, I'm talking about local government, I'm talking about the private sector, I'm talking as a national park as well. We should have treated this lift of lockdown as a major event. And I think when you look at the Eisteddfod that comes into these small communities, and we had the National Eisteddfod coming through Llangollen last year, 150,000 people came to Llanrwst. They didn't just sit back and let it happen. They had a plan in place to deal with this huge influx into a small little village in the heartland of the Conwy Valley. And I think what we should have done is got together a lot earlier to plan to say, this is what we expect, this is what we need to put in place, and treat it as one big 6 weeks or 4 or 5 weeks, whatever we had of the summer, as one big festival, and deal with it accordingly as you would if you were organising a huge festival. Whilst we look at the long-term planning, which needs to take place, because there's nothing worse than seeing all these visitors who come to North Wales to enjoy it, being ticketed, having their cars towed away because they're illegally parking. And that's because, in my view, not enough signage, not enough information, definitely not enough car parking, and we need to be a lot better at organising and sorting that out.
We had a number of these, in the Beacons National Park as well, and one of the key hotspots is, yes, Pen y Fan, but it's also the waterfalls country, around Ystradfellte, Penderyn, those areas. And we were doing some work way before COVID. We've got some small communities there. There's a boundary between police forces, local authorities. Quite difficult to pull all those different agencies together to come up with a solution. We were getting there, but extremely slowly. And I do wonder sometimes if when we consider investing in infrastructure, we tend to follow some quite standard procedures. They tend to be economically focused. Perhaps we need to shift a little bit, looking at more social-based prioritisation, should we say, so that we can tackle these issues. Because those problems are only going to get worse now, the longer COVID goes on and the more staycations we have. So, I would certainly like to see agencies coming together from Welsh Government, police, etc., to come up with some proper solutions in time for the next influxes we get. The reality is, for Snowdonia, though, and the Brecon Beacons, this is 12 months of the year now, so we desperately need to sort something out.
You mentioned that anti-visitor rhetoric, Jim, and I don't think it's huge, but it is there on social media. Do you think that the inability of the authorities to make these locations, the honeypot locations, work a bit better than what they do, is that part of what drives that kind of social media argument?
Quite possibly. This all started, especially the anti-visitor, started a long time ago when, probably around about, I would say, March, April. And when the Chancellor announced the rates grant, which was going to help hospitality sector, bed and breakfast, self-catering and others, with a £10,000 or £25,000 grant. Straight away, a number of authorities in Wales jumped on it and said, there's no way, and this is, quote, those greedy second homeowners are going to get access to that funding. That was what was said. And straight away, they went then to Welsh Government and said, look, we need guidelines to protect these greedy second homeowners from getting access to that funding. And what that did was create so much animosity, at which I've got a dossier of emails and reports from people who still, to this day, have lost thousands and thousands of pounds and didn't get a penny because they decided that they weren't going to give those people that paid council tax any of that grant, because that way it would probably prevent those people who are second homeowners getting access to that fund. We know, because we've probably got about 1,500 businesses, and many of them are self-catering B&B. So we know the difference between a second homeowner and also a B&B and a self-catering operator. So we've still to this day, we're getting emails of people who have not had a penny. In England, they were getting it in 3 days. B&Bs where they paid council tax or business rates, 3 days. Some of our businesses, 3 months it took them to get access to that fund. And that, for me, started this whole social media outburst, towards, to visitors and second homeowners and everything else. And I know it's an emotive subject, I'm fully aware of that. But that's what kick-started it, and that's what we witnessed all the way through social media to this day. And for me, I felt so bad for some of those businesses, and we lobbied our MPs, we lobbied our assembly members to try and persuade those councils who were making things very, very difficult for people to get access to that money, which was given to them to support them in this pandemic. Yeah, so it's gone on. I said to you, it's kind of always been there. It hasn't gone away, but I think what COVID has done is just raised it as as an issue. But all I will say is the more west you go across North Wales, the more dependent we are on tourism. And you can see by the economic value, you look at Gwynedd, you look at Conway, they're the powerhouses, and that's predominantly what our industry is tourism.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? The law of unintended consequences with some of these things when you push a policy in a particular way and it sort of rebounds in a different way. I mean, I think what a lot of COVID has brought to me is the importance of good messaging on the way we put things forward, because whether it be from Boris Johnson saying certain things and creating all these sometimes a dreadful way of responding to COVID. Similarly, with the whole issue around second homeowners, highly emotive, unless we're really sensitive on the way we message some of those things, will continue just to stoke up animosity. Can I just go back to, I don't want to lose one of the points we mentioned earlier about some of the hotspot sites and stuff. I do think that we need to be much, much cleverer in Wales, given that it's so important to our economy, on managing and advertising some of the not-so-hotspot areas and spreading, if you like, the tourism pound, whatever it may be, across Wales slightly more evenly. I know it's very difficult at the moment when you've got different publications saying, the top 10 places to go in Wales and all the rest of it. But we've got to be quite a lot more subtle about that, really, and spread people around and take the pressure off some of those hotspot areas, because there are far better places to climb than Snowdon, to be fair.
100% agree with you. And this is a plug for our new podcast, Adventures in North Wales. And it's exactly what we've done. And we've targeted those places, Llanarmon, Ruthin, and places that are just off the beaten track that are absolutely beautiful. But you're right, the honeypot of Snowdonia, there are so many other places to go and visit. And, what we've tried to do, in terms of spread, our marketing spread and our itinerary planners and everything else, is to spread it right across the whole of North Wales. But, Snowdon is an iconic place that people, want to go and challenge themselves and climb it. And, they bring in hundreds of thousands of people just to climb, Snowdon and go on the train. And, it's world iconic. So, it's a difficult one to manage. It really is.
I've still not got the attraction of queuing up to stand on that bit right at the very peak. It kind of takes away some of the glamour and romance of it,
No, you're right. It does.
I want to do a marketing campaign that says Wales has more than 2 mountains, because it seems it's only Snowdon and Pen y Fan we get a look in, and there are a couple more we can boost.
I'm just going to say what's interesting. I know we focused on Snowdonia, but in the Clywyddian Range and Molfamau, they had exactly the same issues, because an ambulance couldn't get through because of the cars, the way they were parked, in order to treat a suspected casualty, and that caused a lot of problems. But we don't hear much about that, but it's happening. We do hear about the Brecon Beacons, and we do hear about Pembrokeshire, and we hear about Snowdonia, but it does happen right across the area.
In your experience, the problems we saw in the honeypot sites, it was wider than that. It was in far more less well-known areas of Wales where they had those problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially the places where people can go outdoors and get the fresh air and everything else. And it comes back to what I said right at the beginning. It's all about managing the basic fundamentals of managing the destination. We know these places are going to be busy. We knew they were going to be busy, and we just waited for it to happen and then reacted. And that's when all the social media rhetoric and anti-visitor came through.
I wasn't going to touch on this, but you've both mentioned second homes. Do you still see that as a big issue then in Welsh society? I
do have views on this, and they're probably not going to suit everybody. But I come from a rural part of Wales. I know what it's like to have to leave those places because you can't get a job that pays sufficient monies to be able to afford a house. I think there's something fundamentally wrong when local people can't afford to even get on the bottom rung of a ladder in their locality. I fundamentally think it's wrong. houses have been seen more and more as an investment, as something for the future. Buy 2, 3, 4 of them. Whereas really, we've lost sight that fundamentally it's about a home for somebody. It's a difficult one to change, that really is, because it's kind of become embedded in our psyche now that, owning your house and maybe getting another one and seeing the prices go up and down and you think that you're worth a lot more than, it's, we've lost sight of what a home is about, in my view.
I agree entirely with Ed, and I think it's not just about the rural areas, it's about the whole of Wales at this moment in time. And young people trying to get on the ladder is very, very difficult for them at this moment in time. We've been saying for many, many years we want to retain the youngsters, we want to keep them in their localities and everything else. But if the jobs aren't there, they have to go away. But what they want to do is come back eventually. And I know my children have done exactly that. One is still away, but eventually he'll want to come home. But how on earth he's ever going to be able to afford a house, even in the urban areas, of North Wales, let alone, some of the nice idyllic rural areas where the houses are extremely expensive. I think how you tackle it, either you create more social housing for local people specifically, or, if you're selling your house, it's highly unlikely that you're going to just sell it to someone from that community because you want the highest price, and that's the juggling you're going to have to do. Unless the council come in and subsidise, local people in order to purchase it, but local people will want the best price, for their house, and I think that's where the issue starts. Or you build more housing.
I suppose you add to that as well the whole, right to buy thing as well. It took away those social housing, those council houses. Now, I'm not saying if you were in a council house and you were able to buy that property, what a wonderful thing, fantastic. But it took away another property from that locality that could have been used to house young families. So, this is a long-standing issue. It's not going to be an easy one to break. I'll tell you a quick story of something with a national park that we dealt with. We would always have issues around barn conversions, and inevitably they tended to be bought up by people with a bit more cash behind them, converted into something, sold on to a house which is going to be outside of the range of anybody in the locality, really. And in terms of farms, we did put a kind of mechanism in there which kept it within the farm ownership. But we did, get a lot of flack for that because it meant that somebody couldn't develop their part of their home or their property to sell on and make a bit of money. So, but ultimately, I still think that was for the right reasons because it kept that new property, or that refurbished property, within a farming community, within that family. But yeah, you're not going to be very popular as a politician doing some of this, or not across the board anyway. So yeah, another reason for not being a politician, really.
Well, do you know what? My home is Llandudno, and I want to buy a home in Llandudno, but I can't afford it.
How do you reconcile these views for young people wanting to be able to support them to be able to get on the property ladder? But in these areas, the economy has become such that it is primarily very seasonal, based around its tourism industry.
Do you think COVID gives us an opportunity here, just in terms of you don't necessarily have to travel to a workplace anymore? Not in quite the same way. It doesn't suit every job, I know. But surely there has to be a proportion of jobs where you can work within your community, either in your home or in a, I don't know, some kind of community centre or something like that. Ed
is just reading off my social media feed.
I've always believed that, Kerry. But, it is, we do have an opportunity to turn things around here a little bit socially. And maybe it does give us an opportunity.
I was going to say, my only concern about that, and I'm looking at, and I've just spent a bit of time in London recently and also Manchester last week. And, there are economic powerhouses for the whole of the UK. They must all be in North Wales because we're so busy at this moment in time. Because I'll tell you what, London and Manchester are desperate. Friday night in Manchester is normally one of the busiest nights. We had a walk, and the reason I was walking around Manchester was trying to find our tram, because we've got a tram wrapped, as North Wales, the adventure capital and so on. And I was trying to find it, but it was like a ghost town. And in London, there's very few people in the offices. So those people not being in the offices are not going out spending their money They're not going out to the cafes, the restaurants, the bars, renting the accommodation, which a lot of pension plans are around, all this accommodation and the renting of these buildings and so on. It's a big, big issue. We know the internationals aren't going to come back until probably spring 2021. But, the staycators and the short breaks, they're looking for places like the lakes, like Scotland, like Wales to go, probably not the cities of London, Birmingham, Leeds and Manchester and so on. But economically, it's going to be a big issue going forward if those don't start to flourish again for everybody.
Yeah, it's a good point. I had heard sort of anecdotally some stuff from Ceredigion, that people felt, well, they don't need to work in London or wherever it may be, so let's buy a property in Ceredigion and we'll work from there, until they find the broadband connection isn't maybe quite as good as they thought it was. But the role of government or one of the roles of government is to sort of enable some of these potentially quite significant social changes, and I would expect them. But it's interesting, I think, the different take, I guess, between a Welsh government, which is saying, work from home as much as you can, keep doing it. It's great to do, and we'll find another way around this. And you've got a UK government, which is saying, a bit like Jim said, get back into the cities and buy your coffee from your Starbucks down the road or whatever. I prefer the Welsh approach. I think there's a potential shift away from town centres, city centres, to allow some of the outlying areas to flourish a little bit more. And so you haven't got a coffee shop maybe in the middle of Cardiff, but you've got it in maybe Blaenfron, somewhere like that, But there needs to be an enabling shift, some enablers to help that shift happen,
I think
it's not a particularly easy thing. These are potentially quite significant social changes, but you've got to sense them and decide whether they're the right things to do, and then support them and enable those changes.
I think the First Minister was saying today about, the flexibility to have both, to have that freedom to be able to work from home, but also to go into that office. Because an example that we have up in Colwyn Bay, part of the regeneration strategy, they built a huge council office to house nearly 600 people. Because, Colwyn Bay on the periphery is absolutely beautiful and the town centre needs some stimulus. So what they did, they built this big council building in order for those people to go out into the towns and start spending their money in the cafes. And sure enough, new cafes were opening, new shops were opening, and it was starting to, see, a little bit more in terms of being busy. But now with COVID, very few staff are in those offices. The talk is, will they be back? And will this building that they've just got for don't know how many years left, on their lease, which is a beautiful big building, is it just going to be there, for eternity with no people in it because they're all working from home. So it's going to be a fine balance going forward, I think.
Of course, one of the things they could look with that, Jim, and it's an area I've worked in, is to make it kind of a local office hub for other organisations to use as well, so you can bring people in.
Yeah, I don't agree with that, Kerry, because I think then that's displacement, because we've got a lot of businesses that have already got their offices and they're already being hit hard because, people are working from home and said, what, we don't need an office anymore. So, they're getting hit hard. And I think in Colwyn Bay, as an example, there's quite a few of office spaces that are, business-led and commercially run. So for, the public sector who's used the public purse to build this building and then to go and directly compete with them, I think is probably a little bit unfair, and it's probably a class of displacement.
One of the areas I just wanted to explore is just the view that tourism is a low-wage economy and it is that seasonal approach, which Matt said. And I know that in some parts of Wales that's true, in other parts it's not, and it's the lifeblood of the local economy. How do you see the future of tourism? Do you think we can move it up that value chain in any way?
For us, it seems to be going that way. We kind of conjoined organisations, public, private, have been saying we want to make our offer all year round to specifically deal with those issues you just raised, seasonality and so on. Our campaigns tend to now take place in the shoulder season. So we spend a lot of our time and our money, marketing, around about now for October leading into November in order to try and keep the businesses open. And then we start again, just before January, February, start for the Easter period. But in the summer, we're busy. So it's pointless doing any marketing in the summer. there's examples of the new industry coming in, and especially, I've used Zipworld as a classic example, from what I can recount, 221 jobs, local jobs, predominantly Welsh speakers, well paid, well above the minimum wage, all year round as much as they possibly can, and that's why they've created these indoor attractions. And more businesses are starting to create indoor attractions, and we've got lots of examples of investment at Venture Parks, Snowdonia and Dolgarrog. Huge indoor adrenaline offer they've created, as well as their surf lagoon, which normally closes in November and then opens again in March, but they've created an indoor venue. Now they're about to build, a 106-bedroom Hilton hotel, so, they're not doing that with just, the seasonality in mind. They're looking at trying to create this, all year round offer. And I think more and more businesses that we talk to are trying to do exactly the same thing. The quality is raising, the investment is going in there. And, but I think for me, there just seems to be, more career opportunities with these big companies that are investing in our destination.
I think as well, it is about, I agree with you in terms of the all year round destination. We talk about the weather all the time, but really that's the weather is part of the experience if you're into those types of holidays, I guess. But some people do just want to come and, and walk by the seaside. In terms of the quality of the jobs, I think we've also done ourselves down, because if we see them as low skilled, low value jobs, that's what they'll be, in terms of it is an important job giving good service to people. So that's part of the thing, I think, in terms of raising the standards and how much money goes into the local economy. I was up in Zipworld about a fortnight ago, actually, and it is a great product. It's a great quality product. I think perhaps in the past, quality has been variable in a lot of attractions. I'm certainly hoping that when Zipworld comes to Rhugos, in Hiraeth, that we get a similar kind of product there, tying it in as well to some of the other honeypot, the waterfalls area, for instance, and just trying to align some of these things so that they feed off each other to a certain extent. So you spread the wealth a little bit from the honeypots to some of the other areas as well. But I think for me, it's about quality and 12 months of the year quality as well.
Yeah, totally endorse that.
So if we see that as the future with tourism, intrinsic into our economy in many of these areas, what about some of the kind of policy suggestions that have emerged in the government kind of agenda on that? Would you think what we've talked about is about improving infrastructure? What do you think of that kind of suggestion that we have a small bedroom tax or something like that?
We've been through this before with Welsh Government, when they put the proposal forward for the 4 taxes, and one of them was a tourism tax. And as we do with everything, we go out and we consult businesses on this, and they were totally opposed to it. And then we thought, it had been dropped, and lo and behold, obviously the Welsh Government had started speaking to local authorities to bring in a tourism tax. Now, at this moment in time, we're at 5% VAT, which is great, but we were one of the highest, paying VAT areas in probably in Europe. But now it's 5%. Obviously, it's helping. How long that's going to stay at 5%, who knows? But I think, tourism tax is never a emotive issue. And if we knew, where the money was going to be invested, and there's a real reason I say that, because everyone uses the justification that it's going to be spent on infrastructure. However, Welsh Government already give local authorities what's called an enhanced population grant because the influx of visitors that come into that areas, and it's quite substantial. So the first thing we need to know, if there's infrastructure work that needs to be doing, where's that money going? What's that money being spent on? Because when I say substantial, it is substantial. And once we know that, and we then know, right, we're going to start taxing, is it going to be on hospitality? Is it going to be on tourism? It's quite a complex thing. What's going to happen to the money? Where's it going to go? And that's what businesses will want to know if all of a sudden this policy is forced upon, the industry.
I'm going to disagree, not with Jim here, but certainly with sort of the feedback that he's had from the businesses. And I understand any businesses are going to say on another tax, but for me, I really think it's a no-brainer. Different European cities, from parts of Europe, apply a tax. You kind of notice it a little bit, but you don't really notice it that much. I think the key, as Jim said, is where that money goes, and is it earmarked for the infrastructure in that particular area. And I think, I mean, you can do that. If you want to just throw it back out to local authorities, what do they call it, non-hypothecated or whatever, spend it as you will, then you're going to lose it. There's no two ways about that. But if you sell it on the basis of, improvements to those particular localities, improving the offer, then I think you can start to convince a few people there. I think what people have seen with the COVID, the staycations, if you like, and the pressure it's put on infrastructure, I think now has got to be the time to do it because we have seen the creaking of this system. And I come back to what I said before about how we prioritise investment in infrastructure. If we do it just purely on economic returns and we just it's same old, same old. We need to start focusing a lot more on the environmental and social aspects of, we say we're a sustainable development nation, where we're not necessarily practicing what we preach. Invest it on those social issues as much as some of the economic issues, tie it into those local communities so that they can see what their tax is going to be spent on, and they can have a say in how that's spent as well. But, for me, it's a no-brainer. Others do it, and I think I can't see us getting any funding any other way, put it that way.
We're coming up to the end of the pod, gents, and I just wanted you to consider, where you think tourism is going in Wales, both if the pandemic continues, how that's going to hit tourism, but also should we get back onto an even keel? Where do you see the tourism industry in Wales for the rest of this decade?
First and foremost, the next few months are going to be crucial to the survival of many, many businesses and thousands of jobs. First priority is about survival and getting people through as safely as possible this last part of 2020. So they can look forward to 2021 with some optimism. Hopefully by then, fingers crossed, we may have a vaccine, things may be looking a little bit better. But for the sake of, an industry that we depend on in North Wales, and from the communique that we've had with those businesses, the next few months, October, November, especially December, are crucial to the survival of many, many businesses. Our organisation, we're already out there at the moment. We keep pushing that about short breaks. We're not closed now. Summer's finished. We're still open. Keep coming to support our restaurants, come and support our accommodation and so on. And we'll drive that forward. We've been making huge inroads with the Japanese. You may or may not have heard, but from a North Wales perspective, we've just twinned Conway Castle with Himeji Castle. We've had an influx, of thousands of Japanese visitors coming to North Wales that we never had before, because they were going to Chester. They were stopping at the border of Chester, and they carried on going down the border of Wales down into Bath and then Oxford and London and home. So there's huge opportunity there with high spending international visitors. And we've been quite specific with the Japanese, because you may not be aware of this, but they designated, and everyone laughs when I say this, and I can't understand why, but they designated the A55 as one of the top 20 most beautiful roads in Europe. And they called it the Road of Castles in Wonderland. And that was to promote Japanese tourists to come to 20 locations throughout Europe, because they noted a huge dip in the number of Japanese visitors visiting Europe after the terrorist outrages and so on. And they needed to do something about it. And they created these campaigns. And the first one was the top 30 most beautiful towns and villages. Conway was selected. And we had 3 years of promotion by the powerhouse of Japanese tourism, Conway. And then all of a sudden, the numbers started to increase and the spend started to go up. Then it went to the roads. Then we twinned the castle, and we've got fantastic relationships. So international Pacific countries, from an international perspective, is something that organisations like us, are quite keen to work on, because we've now got the recipe. Staycation, investment in quality. We've got some really good high-end restaurants now being built and invested in with good renowned chefs. Our produce, our food, and what we've got coming up, which is going to probably make it the most famous castle going, is I'm a Celebrity, get me out of here, in November. Yeah, long term, next 10 years, we definitely need to crack this infrastructure issue that we have, and we have had for many, many years. Sustainability is obviously right up there as one of the key priorities to get sorted. Our infrastructure, our transport, again, goes without saying. But to be honest with you, this is the stuff we've been talking about for 10, 15 years, and we still haven't cracked it. And the reason we haven't cracked it is because we're not all gelling together, and we're not working to a focus to, manage those big issues that we've been speaking about this evening.
I think from my perspective, I think interesting to see the international flavour there from Jim, and if you can get those off the A55 and down into the other bits of Wales where there's more castles, even better. But I think for me it's the staycation bit. I'm a North Walian, or mid to North Wales, lived down in Cardiff for a long time now. It never ceases to amaze me the amount of people from the south who have not been to the north, and it's just bonkers. If we can, up the level of quality and market within Wales as well as beyond Wales, then I think there's a market in here as well. I know it's easy to be lulled by the kind of weather that we've had through this summer, and it has been fantastic, and it won't always be this way. But again, that's part of the marketing. Starting to see a few people sort of talking about we're going to go from the valleys up to zip wire and stuff, starting to happen, but it's slow, So I'd like to see that internal market being exploited as well as the external market, And I know for Jim up in the north of Wales there, you've got some big conurbations there in northwest England, but we've got some pretty big bits of Wales as well. So I'd like to see that happening a lot more. But for me, it depends on getting that quality right, as Jim said, the infrastructure, and whether people come from outside or inside Wales, the whole respect thing. And we'll only do that if we respect the industry ourselves.
On that note, I just want to say thank you to the both of you for coming on the show this evening. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do so, Jim?
My Twitter account is at JJJJ86.
Thank you very much, Jim. Ed?
Yeah, Twitter's the way to go, isn't it? At Ed Evans Wales.
Wonderful, nice and simple. Thank you so much for both being here. If you want to hear more about what we're doing at Hiraeth, please find us on Facebook and Medium at HiraethBlogCymru and on Twitter at HiraethBlog. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.